Okay, so our big question for today is, can I identify when the subjunctive form is being used? So, thinking about giving advice, what would you suggest for these problems? I've got a terrible cough, I just can't get rid of it. Oh no, I've forgotten my lunch again. So I want you just to have a little think about what advice you might give to those two different scenarios. Did anybody begin their suggestion with the phrase, if I were you, I would? So, for example, for a terrible cold, you might say, if I were you, I would try taking some paracetamol. I've forgotten my lunch again. If I were you, I'd write it down on a post-it note so you remember for tomorrow. That is you using the subjunctive form. So strange new verbs. So we're going to look at what the subjunctive form is. And having a look at these sentences, can we notice anything unusual about the verbs? Remember, a verb is a doing word, it's an action. If John were to get an A on his test, I would be very surprised. Were I a little bit taller, I would be able to reach the shelf. I would run if I were younger. If I were him, I'd try a lot harder at school. Now you might notice that the word were is in bold on every single one of these sentences. This is the subjunctive form. We wouldn't usually say those sentences like that. We might say them like this. If John got an A on his test, I would be very surprised. If I was a little bit taller, I would be able to reach the shelf. I would run if I was younger. If I was him, I'd try a lot harder at school. So you'll notice to put them into the subjunctive form, we have changed was to were. So rather than if John got an A on his test, or if I was a little bit taller, if John were to get an A on his test, were I a little bit taller? So the subjunctive form can also be used to show that we don't think the situation is really possible. So I'm not going to cool down anytime soon. Japanese isn't going to be taught here. So the subjunctive form isn't common in everyday British speech. However, it can be used after formal verbs such as require, demand, suggest, propose. We've done lots of work on formal vocabulary, so think back to some examples that we've come across in our lessons. So, for example, the governors propose that Class 5 learn maths all day. The Queen demands that all children be taught to curtsy. Mrs. Smith requires that James Brown go to her office now. Might I suggest that your son wait outside until we have finished our chat? So we're now going to start to look at whether we should be using was or were to complete some sentences. So, we something going to the cinema to eat popcorn. It something time to start packing for my holiday. I'd like you to have a little think now about whether we need to use was, am, or were to complete those sentences. Remember, say it out loud to check that it's grammatically correct. So we should have said we were going to the cinema to eat popcorn. It was time to start packing for my holiday. So looking at these sentences, we're going to think about whether we need to use was or were so that the sentences make sense. They are grammatically correct. He wished he more skillful at football so that he could play for the school team. If I, a musician, I would play the guitar as it is my favourite instrument. So have a little think, would you use was or were to complete those sentences? So we should have identified that we needed to use were for both of those sentences. He wished he were more skillful at football so that he could play for the school team. If I were a musician, I would play the guitar as it is my favourite instrument. So now we need to look at changing the underlined verb so that it is written in the subjunctive form. Now, if you remember back at the start of the lesson, we looked at the fact that the verb was changed to were so that it was written in the subjunctive form. So at the moment, our sentence is, I wish I was chosen to compete in the athletics competition. I've worked so hard in training. So what do I need to change was to so that this sentence is written in the subjunctive form? So we needed to change the verb was to were. I wish I were chosen to compete in the athletics competition. I've worked so hard in training. So we've now changed that sentence so that it is written in the subjunctive form. You might have noticed a pattern where we see were in our sentences that often means that they are written in that subjunctive form. So now we need to rewrite the sentence so that it is in the subjunctive form. At the moment, my sentence reads, if I was going on a trip this weekend, I would like to go on the train to Edinburgh. So I'd now like you on a piece of paper to write down what that sentence would be in the subjunctive form. So pause the video while you write your sentence. So you should have changed was to were. This means that our sentence is now written in the subjunctive form. If I were going on a trip this weekend, I would like to go on the train to Edinburgh. Now, although that isn't necessarily how we'd say that sentence, remember back at the beginning, it said that using the subjunctive form is not common in the English language. It's not how we would speak every day. So now we need to tick the sentence or sentences, so it could be singular or plural, that are written in the subjunctive form. Remember that verb to look for that can help us to identify the subjunctive form. So A, we could be partners if you were to go on the school trip. If you were to go on the school trip, we could be partners. We could be partners if you was going on the school trip. So I'd like you to make a note of the letters of the sentences which have been written in the subjunctive form. So pause the video and make a note of what you think. So we should have ticked sentence A and sentence B. In sentence A, if you were to go on the school trip, we can see that verb were, it's been written in the subjunctive form. So has sentence B. If you were to go on the school trip, we could be partners. However, sentence C is not written in that subjunctive form because they have used the verb was instead of were. So your first activity for today's lesson is going to be doing some fluency linked to the subjunctive form. So you need to be identifying whether you need to use was or were in sentences, changing verbs so they're written in the subjunctive form, and identifying whether the subjunctive form has been used or not within a sentence. You can find both the activity and the answers under the heading Wednesday, then Grammar. So what I'd like you to do is to come off the video and complete activity 1, check that you've got the answers right with the answer sheet, and then come back to the video ready to prepare yourself for activity 2. Okay, so you now should have completed activity 1 and the answers were on there as well, so you can check to see how many you've got right. We're now going to move on to look at preparing ourselves ready for activity 2. So we've done some fluency work linked with the subjunctive form, and we're now going to look at some reasoning. So I've got a question here that's asking me whether the statement below is written in the subjunctive form, and I need to identify whether that's true or false. If they was going to book the tickets for the show, they would need to do it quickly before they sold out. Now, if I look at the beginning of that sentence, I can see that it says, if they was going to book the tickets. And I know there's a particular verb I need to look for the subjunctive form. So what do you think? Do you think that this sentence is written in the subjunctive form, so it's true? Or do you disagree? Do you not think this has used a subjunctive form? If you have a look under here as well, you'll see it's asking me to explain how I know. We know that we've got to use a subordinating conjunction because when we're explaining. So this is false. The sentence is not written in the subjunctive form because it's used was instead of were. Remember, were is that verb that we need to look for to identify that subjunctive form. So Gabrielle and Ben are writing sentences in the subjunctive form. If I were to have one wish, I would wish to be a professional footballer. If I had one wish, it would be to become a professional footballer. Who is correct? Explain why. So straight away, I know that Ben is the person that is correct because if I have a look at his sentence, he says, if I were. And I know that if the verb were has been used, it's been written in the subjunctive form. So Ben is correct because he has used a subjunctive form were in order to indicate wishful thinking. Okay? So it's highlighting there that can be used for hypothetical statements or unreal situations, which is something that we looked at right back at the beginning of the lesson when we might use it to show that we think something's not possible, that situation can't happen. So it's now asking me to create a sentence written in the subjunctive form, which includes the words below. So I'm now going to practice modelling my own sentence. So if I have a look at these words, the sentence that comes into my head is, if I were rich, I would buy a large house with a swimming pool. I could also have, if I were rich, I would buy a house with a large pool. So I can mix that vocabulary around, but what was really important in both of those example sentences was that I used the subjunctive form because I said, if I were. So an example sentence might be, if I were rich, I would buy a large house with a swimming pool. So your second activity for today's lesson, you're going to be using your reasoning skills to explain whether statements are true or false, explain who is correct, and create your own sentences using the subjunctive form. So all of those things that we've just practiced doing together. Remember, if the question is asking you why, or to explain something, you need to use that subordinating conjunction because, so that you can explain your thinking and your answer. You can find your second activity and the answers under the heading Wednesday, then grammar. So I'd now like you to pause the video again, go off and complete the second activity, and then come back to it so we can do a little bit of a sum of the lesson together. Okay, so what have we learned about the subjunctive form today then? We've learnt that it's used in formal language. So if we use formal vocabulary, we're more likely to use the subjunctive form. It can be used to give advice or talk about an unreal situation. So this is a hypothetical situation, something that's maybe not real, something that's really unlikely to happen. The subjunctive form follows certain verbs or expressions. So we know that we needed to look for that verb were to identify the subjunctive form. And we notice that we often changed was to were. If I were you though, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Okay, so there's an example sentence there to finish off that is using that subjunctive form. Hopefully you're feeling much more confident than you were at the beginning of the lesson. However, if you have any questions or want any more support, then feel free to send me an email and I can answer any questions you might have. Remember, you can also share with me some pictures of this work that you've done and I can pop them on our Year 6 Learning Gallery.